In an interview before his death, John Lennon said he was really hurt by you, that you'd never mentioned in your autobiography any of the influence that he had on you.
He was annoyed because I didn't say that he had written one line of this song, Taxman. But
did you tell him that?
Well, I didn't, because he was already dead after that. But the point to that was that I also didn't say how I wrote 2 lines to Come Together or 3 lines to Eleanor Rigby.
It is a well-known fact that John Lennon was offended by George Harrison's 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine. John said months before his death that the book had affected him because George didn't really mention him. He claimed to have inspired and assisted George in songwriting. On the other hand, George claimed that John exaggerated his own impact. In 1980, during the Playboy interview, John said, "Well, I was hurt by George's book, I, Me, Mine, so this message will go to him." He put a book out privately on his life that, by glaring omission, says that my influence on his life is absolutely zilch and nil. In his book, which is purportedly this clarity of vision of his influence on each song he wrote, he remembers every 2-bit sax player or guitarist he met in subsequent years. I'm not in the book, Lennon continued, because George's relationship with me was one of young follower and older guy. He's 3 or 4 years younger than me. It's a love-hate relationship, and I think George still bears resentment toward me for being a daddy who left home. He would not agree with this, but that's my feeling about it. I was just hurt. I was just left out, as if I didn't exist. I don't want to be that egomaniacal, but he was like a disciple of mine when we started. I was already an art student when Paul and George were still in grammar school, equivalent to high school in the US. There is a vast difference between being in high school and being in college, and I was already in college and already had sexual relationships, already drank and did a lot of things like that. When George was a kid, he used to follow me and my first girlfriend, Cynthia, who became my wife, around. We'd come out of art school and he'd be hovering around like those kids at the gate of the Dakota now. I remember the day he called to ask for help on Taxman, one of his bigger songs. I threw in a few one-liners to help the song along because that's what he asked for. He came to me because he couldn't go to Paul, because Paul wouldn't have helped him at that period. I didn't want to do it. I thought, oh no, don't tell me I have to work on George's stuff. It's enough doing my own and Paul's. But because I loved him and I didn't want to hurt him, when he called me that afternoon and said, "Will you help me with this song?" I just sort of bit my tongue and said, "Okay." It had been John and Paul so long, he'd been left out because he hadn't been a songwriter up until then. As a singer, we allowed him only 1 track on each album. If you listen to the Beatles' first albums, the English versions, he gets a single track. The songs he and Ringo sang at first were the songs that used to be part of my repertoire in the dance halls. I used to pick songs for them from my repertoire, the easier ones to sing. So I am slightly resentful of George's book. But don't get me wrong, I still love those guys. The Beatles are over, but John, Paul, George, and Ringo go on. George claimed that John's impact was minimal, which is why he left him out of his memoir. What John thought of his memoir was known to George, but before he could discuss it with him, John passed away soon after speaking with Playboy. Afterwards, George shared his thoughts on John's remarks from an interview in 1987. George stated that John had less of an influence on him than John had indicated. George didn't want to get into John assisting him with Taxman while he was writing I, Me, Mine. He didn't see the point because he had assisted John on many songs and wasn't looking for credit. He was annoyed because I didn't say that he'd written 1 line of the song Taxman, George explained. The point to that was I also didn't say how I wrote 2 lines to Come Together or 3 lines to Eleanor Rigby. I wasn't getting into any of that. I think in the balance I would have had more things to be niggled with him about than he would have with me. Regarding John's claims that as a child, George followed him around, George responded that John misread him in the same way that he and Paul always did. Well, that's what he thought, George giggled. I liked him very much. He was a groove, he was a good lad, but at the same time, he misread me. He didn't realize who I was, and this was one of the main faults of John and Paul. They were so busy being John and Paul, they failed to realize who else was around at the time. Numerous narratives exist regarding the friendship and band dynamic between the two. When they first became friends, George looked up to John, but he was by no means John's disciple. When the need arose, he knew how to hold his ground against John. When George joined the Beatles, he felt that he had embarrassed John. George, however, demonstrated to John that a guitar should have 6 strings. Initially, George admired John, but he never allowed John's sarcasm to get past him. It's also true that, in comparison to Paul or Martin, John gave George a better opportunity with his own tunes. He may have occasionally assisted George in writing a few lines, but George also greatly assisted John. John and George appeared to agree on spiritualism, but when George temporarily left the group in 1969, John wanted Eric Clapton to take George's place right away. Later on, in their recently discovered discussion, John and Paul agreed that they couldn't hold George responsible for quitting given the way they had treated him. Later, in 1971, John Lennon offered an olive branch to George by asking him to contribute to How Do You Sleep. The two rarely ever communicated again after that. Nonetheless, George brought up John in his chats with pals. According to Tom Petty, George wanted John's acceptance pretty bad, and he imagined John would quickly become a traveling Wilbury. Jim Keltner, George's friend, witnessed something similar. Regardless of their closeness, George asserted that John wasn't as powerful as John claimed. John never published a book, so it's hard to say if he would have brought up George. It's unlikely that George would have given a damn, though.
Hello.
That was Ringo, folks.
Well, what can I say?
And goodbye to all of us.
Well, this is Ringo. Everyone seems to have said everything here, so I'll just sign off by saying cheerio and best of luck from the Beatles.